Margaret never imagined her life would change so drastically. At 74, after her divorce 10 years ago, she settled into a quiet existence in her sprawling Victorian home on the outskirts of town. The house, though beautiful, carried the weight of memories, and its creaks and groans reminded her that nothing stayed young forever, not homes, not hearts, despite its size. The house felt like a companion. She loved the mornings filled with light streaming through stained glass windows and the evenings where she would sip tea on the balcony. Imagining what might have been, make sure to subscribe to my channel so I can continue bringing you more fascinating true stories like this one. And don't forget to watch this video till the end and like the video because this story is going to be incredibly interesting. Please hit the like button to show your support. She lived alone, though she had long ago made peace with solitude. Her children lived in different states, caught up in their own lives, and she rarely saw them outside of the holidays. Her days were predictable, punctuated by walks in the garden, afternoons spent reading, and occasional trips to the market. But one summer morning, as she stood in the kitchen making toast, the lights flickered, and the hum of the refrigerator stopped abruptly. She sighed another electrical issue. That's how she met Max. When Max arrived at her door, he didn't look like the electricians she was used to. He was young, perhaps 30, with sharp green eyes and a warm, easy smile. His uniform fit him well, and his hands carried the kind of roughness that spoke of honest hard work. "You must be Mrs. Gallagher," he said, tipping his cap. "I'm Max. You called about some electrical issues." Margaret nodded, feeling oddly self-conscious. "Yes, the power has been acting up for a few days, and this morning it just stopped completely." Max stepped inside, his boots making soft thuds against the polished wood floor. "Let me take a look." He worked quietly, moving between the kitchen and the breaker box in the basement. Margaret found herself watching him more than she should, noticing the way his brow furrowed when he concentrated, the way his hands moved with precision. It had been years since she had someone else in the house, and his presence filled the empty spaces in a way she hadn't expected. "How long have you lived here?" Max asked as he worked. He asked about the house, about how long she'd lived there. His voice was kind, and there was no judgment when she admitted that the place had seen better days. "This house has character," he said, smiling as he inspected the wiring beneath the sink. "They don't make them like this anymore." "You're being polite," Margaret replied with a laugh. "It's old and stubborn, just like its owner," Max chuckled, a sound that was warm and genuine. "Old doesn't mean useless. Sometimes the best things just need a little extra care." The words lingered in the air, and Margaret felt a flush rise to her cheeks. She told herself it was nothing, just a friendly comment. By the time he finished, the sun was setting, casting the kitchen in a golden glow. "I fixed the immediate problem, but the wiring in this house is ancient," Max explained, packing up his tools. "It could use a full overhaul." Margaret hesitated. The cost of such work would be steep, but she knew it was necessary. How long would it take? A week, maybe more. "I need to check everything room by room," he said. "If you want, I can come by tomorrow to start." There was no reason to hesitate. Yet Margaret found herself agreeing almost too quickly. "That would be wonderful." "Thank you, Max." The next morning, Max returned, and so began a routine that became strangely comforting. Each day he arrived with his toolbox and an easy smile, filling the house with a presence it had been missing. He worked diligently, but they often found themselves talking during his breaks. Margaret learned that he had grown up in a small town nearby and that he had once dreamed of becoming an architect, but had taken over his father's electrical business instead. He was kind, thoughtful, and carried an air of optimism that was contagious. "You're different from most people I meet," he said one afternoon as they sat on the porch drinking lemonade. "Different how?" Margaret asked. "Curious. You don't seem to care about what people think. You're just yourself." "It's refreshing." His words caught Margaret off guard. She hadn't thought of herself as anything special, not in years. But the way he looked at her made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt since her youth. As the days passed, Margaret found herself looking forward to Max's visits more than she cared to admit. There was an ease between them, a quiet understanding that didn't need to be spoken. But there was something else to something unspoken, undeniable, one evening. As Max was finishing up for the day, a sudden summer storm rolled in. The rain came down in sheets, and thunder rumbled in the distance. "You'd better stay until it passes," Margaret said. Watching the storm from the window, Max nodded, setting his tools aside. "Looks like I don't have much choice." They sat in the living room, the sound of rain filling the silence. Margaret handed him a cup of tea, and their hands brushed for a moment. It was a small thing, but it sent a spark through her that she couldn't ignore. "Thank you," Max said, his voice softer than usual. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the storm outside seemed to fade away. Margaret wished she could say that she fully understood what was happening between them, but the truth was she didn't. She only knew that Max's presence had awakened something in her that she thought was long gone, a sense of possibility, of connection. But with that came fear. He was young, and she was not. The world would look at them and see something absurd, something inappropriate. Yet, when he smiled at her, she felt like none of that mattered. The storm raged on outside, but the room felt warm, almost stifling, as Max and Margaret sat there in the dim glow of the table lamp. His presence was grounding, yet it stirred something electric within her. For the first time in years, she felt alive. Max leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands cradling the teacup. "You know," he began, his voice low and thoughtful, "I don't think I've ever been in a house that felt so much like a home." Margaret tilted her head, studying him. "What makes you say that?" He gave a soft chuckle, glancing around at the carefully chosen furniture, the fading wallpaper, the rows of books on the shelves. "It's not the house itself, it's you. There's something about the way you care for this place, the stories you must have lived within these walls. It's like it has a soul." His words warmed Margaret in a way she couldn't quite explain. "You're giving me too much credit," she said, smiling to deflect the sudden vulnerability she felt. "I don't think I am," Max replied, his gaze meeting hers. There was a quiet intensity in his eyes that made her heart skip. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken words. Margaret should have looked away, but she couldn't. Instead, she felt herself leaning forward, just a fraction, as if pulled by some unseen force. The rain continued to pour outside, a steady rhythm that matched the pounding of her heart. Max's hand moved, hesitating for just a moment before it brushed against hers. The touch was light, tentative, but it sent a jolt through her. He started, his voice barely above a whisper. But whatever he was about to say was lost as Margaret closed the distance between them. It wasn't a decision so much as an instinct to leap into the unknown. Their lips met, soft and searching at first, but the kiss deepened quickly, fueled by a longing Margaret hadn't realized was there. Max's hand moved to her cheek, cupping it gently as if afraid she might pull away. But she didn't. She couldn't. When they finally broke apart, breathless and wide-eyed, Margaret searched his face for any sign of hesitation or regret, but all she saw was him raw, open, and completely unguarded. "I'm sorry," Margaret said, though she wasn't sure what she was apologizing for. "Don't be," Max replied, his voice firm, but kind. "Please don't." That night, something shifted between them. The kiss wasn't just a moment. It was a turning point, a quiet acknowledgement of what had been building between them all along. But with it came questions and fears Margaret wasn't ready to face. The next day, Max arrived as usual, but there was a subtle difference in the way he looked at her, the way he lingered just a little longer in the doorway, the way his hand brushed hers when he handed her a tool. Margaret found herself watching him again, but this time there was no denying the pull she felt toward him. "You're distracted today," Max said, catching her gaze with a teasing smile. "Am I?" Margaret replied, trying to sound nonchalant. He straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. "If I didn't know better, I'd say you're spying on me." Margaret laughed, but the sound was nervous. "Maybe I just like the company." Max's smile softened, and for a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. It was as if everything the years Margaret had spent alone, the aching quiet of this house, the fear she had never voiced faded into the background. This young man, so vibrant and full of life, stood before her with a mixture of tenderness and hesitation. Max's last day in Margaret's home felt more significant than she could admit aloud. "I guess this is it," he said, his voice barely audible. There was a heaviness in his tone that made Margaret's chest tighten. She tried to steady herself, to sound calm, but her words wavered. "Yes, it seems so," she replied. Max shifted, his hands fidgeting slightly before he tucked them into his pockets. "It's strange, isn't it, how quickly time passes? Feels like just yesterday I was fixing your circuit breaker for the first time." Margaret smiled, the memory fresh in her mind. She remembered how awkward and shy he had been that first day, so professional and polite. Over time, his walls had come down, and they had found an easy rhythm, sharing stories and laughter during his breaks. Now that rhythm was about to end, and the thought left her hollow. "I'm going to miss our chats," Margaret admitted softly. "You've brought so much life into this house, Max. It hasn't felt this warm in years." Max looked at her then, his gaze steady and searching, as though he was trying to memorize every line of her face. "You've been amazing, Margaret, more than I could have ever expected." There was a pause, a moment of stillness where the air between them seemed to thrum with unspoken words. Before she could think better of it, Margaret reached out and touched his hand. His skin was warm under hers, and he didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers closed around hers, firm yet gentle. The words tumbled out of her before she could stop them. "I don't want this to be goodbye." Max's breath caught, and for a heartbeat, he said nothing. Then, with a sudden urgency, he stepped closer. "Margaret," he murmured, his voice low and intimate. "I don't want it to be either." His hand came up to her chest, and she leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. When she opened them again, his face was so close to hers that she could feel his breath against her skin. The world seemed to tilt as he closed the distance between them. His lips brushed against hers in a kiss that was as tender as it was electrifying. It was the kind of kiss that made time stand still. That made her forget everything, but the way his mouth moved against hers, the way his hands slid to her waist, pulling her closer for the first time in years. His eyes shining with something she couldn't quite name. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "Let's just enjoy this moment." And so they did. The day stretched on, each moment tinged with a bitter sweetness that neither of them acknowledged aloud. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Max offered to stay for tea, and Margaret eagerly agreed. While she prepared the tea in the kitchen, she couldn't help but feel a sense of hope blooming within her. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe there was a way for them to continue seeing each other, to explore whatever this was between them. She set the tray with care, arranging the cups and biscuits just so. When she carried it back to the living room, a soft smile on her lips, she found the space empty. "Max," she called out, placing the tray on the table. Her voice echoed in the quiet house. Panic prickled at the edges of her mind as she searched each room. When she reached the guest bedroom, where he had been working earlier, her heart sank. Her jewelry box lay open on the dresser, its contents gone. Her grandmother's antique watch was missing, along with a few other valuable items. She stood frozen, her mind racing. It didn't make sense. Max wouldn't. He couldn't. But the evidence was undeniable. She tried calling him, her hands trembling as she dialed his number, but each attempt went straight to voicemail. Over and over, her heart broke a little more with each unanswered ring. That night, she sat alone in her house, staring at the empty spaces where her treasured belongings had been. But it wasn't the stolen items that hurt the most. It was the betrayal, the realization that she had let her guard down, had opened her heart, only to have it shattered. For weeks, Margaret replayed everything in her mind, searching for clues, for signs that she had missed. She couldn't understand how someone who had seemed so genuine, so kind, could do something so cruel. Months later, as she was cleaning out a drawer in the living room, She found an envelope tucked away beneath a stack of old magazines. Her name was scrawled on the front in Max's handwriting. Her hand shook as she opened it, unfolding the letter inside. Margaret. The letter began, "I know you probably hate me right now, and you have every right to. What I did was unforgivable. I took advantage of your kindness, of your trust, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. But I need you to know that what we shared, those moments we had together, they were real. You made me feel something I hadn't felt in a long time, something I didn't think I was capable of feeling. And that scared me. I'm not a good man, Margaret. I've made mistakes, and I'll probably make more, but meeting you changed me, even if I wasn't brave enough to show it. I'm sorry for everything. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me someday." Tears blurred Margaret's vision as she read his words. They didn't erase what he had done, didn't bring back the items he had stolen or the trust he had broken, but they gave her a small sense of closure, a sliver of understanding. She reread the letter several times, each word a bittersweet reminder of the man she had let into her life and her heart. His actions had caused her pain, but his words hinted at a struggle within him, a war between the person he wanted to be and the person he felt he had to be. Margaret folded the letter carefully, placing it back into the envelope. She sat there in silence. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now felt colder, emptier. But as the hours passed, she realized that she wasn't angry anymore, not at him, not at herself. She had loved and trusted, and while that trust had been broken, it didn't diminish the bravery it took to open her heart in the first place. The next morning, she began to reclaim her life. She reported the theft to the authorities, not with the hope of retrieving the stolen items, but as a step toward moving forward. She also reached out to her bank to ensure her financial security. Max might have taken some tangible pieces of her life, but she wouldn't let him take her peace of mind. Over the following weeks, Margaret filled the empty spaces in her home with new memories. She redecorated, planting vibrant flowers in the garden and hanging new artwork on the walls. Each small change was a declaration that her life would go on, but there were moments when she missed him. She missed the way he had looked at her, like she was the most important person in the world. She missed the easy conversations, the shared laughter, and yes, she missed the way he had made her feel beautiful, wanted, alive. One evening, she sat at her desk with a blank sheet of paper in front of her. The words poured out before she even realized what she was writing. "Max, you hurt me more than I thought possible, but you also reminded me of something I had long forgotten: the power of love. Even when it's imperfect, you gave me back a piece of myself I thought was lost forever. I don't know where you are or if you'll ever read this, but I want you to know that, despite everything, I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I deserve to move on without bitterness in my heart. Thank you for the good and the bad, for the joy and the lessons. I hope you find your way, just as I'm finding mine. Margaret." She folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. She didn't intend to send it, but writing it gave her a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. Months later, on a rainy afternoon, there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find a woman standing there, holding a small box. "Are you Margaret?" the woman asked, her voice soft but firm. Margaret nodded, curiosity tinged with apprehension. "This is for you," the woman said, handing her the box. "Max asked me to deliver it." Before Margaret could respond, the woman turned and walked away, disappearing into the rain. Inside the box, Margaret found her grandmother's antique watch, along with a few of the other items Max had taken. Beneath them was a note written in his familiar handwriting. "Margaret, I'm sorry it took me so long to do the right thing. I can't undo the hurt I caused, but I hope this can be a start. Thank you for forgiving me, even when I didn't deserve it." Max. The return of her belongings brought a sense of finality. It was as if a chapter of her life had closed, not with a slam, but with a gentle, resolute click. Margaret didn't hear from Max again after that, and she didn't expect to. But the return of the stolen items spoke volumes about his journey, and it gave her a strange sense of peace. In the end, she chose to remember Max not for the betrayal, but for the light he had brought into her life. However briefly, he had taught her that love, even when flawed, could still be transformative. As the years went on, Margaret carried those lessons with her, embracing life with a renewed sense of hope and courage. And though Max remained a bittersweet memory, she was grateful for the way he had changed her for the better. The house, once filled with silence and solitude, now echoed with laughter and warmth again, not because of him, but because of the strength he had helped her rediscover within herself. And for that, she would always be thankful.